Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates dreamed of prom dresses and college parties, she dreamed of serving her country. At 18, she shocked everyone by enlisting in the Navy instead of accepting her scholarship to the local university. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, was proud, but worried. Her mother cried for weeks. The neighbors whispered about how strange it was for such a pretty girl to choose military life over marriage and babies. Sarah didn't care what anyone thought. She had bigger plans. Basic training was brutal, but Sarah pushed through every challenge. She ran faster, trained harder, and studied longer than most of her male counterparts. Her drill instructors noticed her determination and recommended her for advanced training programs. Within 2 years, she had earned her place in one of the Navy's most elite units. But Sarah's real goal was something even more challenging. She wanted to become a Navy SEAL. At that time, women weren't officially allowed in SEAL training, but Sarah knew change was coming. She prepared herself physically and mentally, training in secret during her off hours. When the military finally opened SEAL training to women, Sarah was among the first to apply. The selection process was grueling. Out of hundreds of applicants, only 12 were chosen for the training program. Sarah was the only woman selected. The training was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She was pushed to her absolute limits every single day. Many of her fellow trainees dropped out within the first few weeks. The instructors seemed determined to break her spirit, constantly reminding her that she didn't belong in a man's world. During one particularly difficult exercise, Sarah was carrying a heavy boat over her head with her team when she collapsed from exhaustion. Instead of helping her up, one instructor laughed and said women would never be strong enough for real combat. Sarah got back up, lifted that boat, and finished the exercise. Months of intense training followed. Sarah learned underwater demolition, advanced weapons handling, survival techniques, and tactical combat strategies. She studied battlefield medicine, communications, and leadership. Every muscle in her body ached constantly, but she never gave up. The graduation ceremony was small and classified. Only a handful of family members were allowed to attend. Sarah's parents sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces as they watched their daughter receive her SEAL Trident pin. She had become one of the first female Navy SEALs in history. After graduation, Sarah was assigned to a special operations unit based in San Diego. Her first few missions were reconnaissance operations in the Middle East. She proved herself capable and reliable, earning the respect of her male teammates who had initially doubted her abilities. But success came with a price. The constant physical demands of SEAL training had taken a toll on her body. Sarah developed chronic back pain and knee problems that she hid from her commanding officers. She was determined not to show any weakness that might be used as evidence that women didn't belong in special operations. Her personal life suffered too. Relationships were nearly impossible to maintain with her demanding schedule and frequent deployments. Many men were intimidated by her career, while others were only interested in her because of it. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated from the civilian world she had once known. Despite the challenges, Sarah loved her work. She felt a deep sense of purpose knowing that her missions helped protect American lives and interests around the world. Her team began to see her not as a woman trying to prove herself, but as a valuable member of their unit. After 3 years of active duty, Sarah decided to transition to reserve status. She wanted to use her military experience in the civilian world while still serving part-time. She moved back to Texas and took a job as a security consultant for a major corporation. The adjustment to civilian life was harder than she expected. People didn't understand her military background or the sacrifices she had made. Some viewed her with suspicion, wondering why a woman would choose such an aggressive career path. Others dismissed her experience entirely, assuming she must have had an easy time because of her gender. Sarah tried to blend in with her new colleagues, but she felt like she was living 2 different lives. At work, she downplayed her military background to avoid uncomfortable questions. At home, she carefully stored her service uniforms and equipment, including her prized SEAL combat gear that she had earned through blood, sweat, and tears. Little did she know that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to be turned upside down by someone from her past who harbored deep resentment about her groundbreaking military career. Marcus Thompson had been one of Sarah's fellow SEAL trainees, but he never made it through the program. He had dropped out during the fourth week, claiming he had injured his shoulder. The truth was that he couldn't handle the mental pressure and the fact that Sarah was performing better than him in most exercises. Marcus came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had fought in World War II, his father in Vietnam, and his two older brothers were both Marines. He had grown up believing that military service was a man's domain, and that women had no place in combat roles. When Sarah succeeded where he had failed, Marcus felt humiliated. He blamed the instructors for going easy on her, and claimed that the standards had been lowered to help women pass. Deep down he knew this wasn't true, but admitting that Sarah was simply better than him was too painful to accept. After leaving the Navy, Marcus struggled to find his place in the civilian world. He bounced from job to job, unable to settle into anything that gave him the sense of purpose and respect he craved. He moved to the same Texas city where Sarah had relocated, though she was unaware of his presence. Marcus worked as a security guard at various locations around the city. The job paid poorly and offered little respect, which only added to his growing resentment. He began spending his free time online, participating in forums where disgruntled veterans complained about the military's changing policies regarding women in combat. Through social media, Marcus had been following Sarah's civilian career. He watched as she received recognition for her consulting work and spoke at conferences about women in the military. Each success she achieved felt like another reminder of his own failure. The breaking point came when Marcus saw a newspaper article about Sarah being honored at a local veterans event. The article mentioned her historic achievement as one of the first female Navy SEALs and included a photo of her in her dress uniform. Marcus stared at that photo for hours, his anger building with each passing minute. That weekend, Marcus decided to take action. He had learned through mutual military contacts that Sarah lived in a townhouse complex on the outskirts of the city. He drove by her neighborhood several times, studying the layout and looking for the best way to approach her home undetected. Sarah had been having a good week. Her consulting business was growing, and she had just signed a major contract with a defense contractor. She was also dating someone new, a fellow veteran who understood and respected her background. For the first time in years, she felt like her life was coming together. On Saturday morning, Sarah decided to do some long-overdue spring cleaning. She had been putting off organizing her spare bedroom, which had become a storage space for boxes from her various moves. Among these boxes were her military uniforms and equipment, including her SEAL gear. Sarah carefully went through each uniform, checking for any damage and deciding what to keep and what to donate. Her dress blues brought back memories of formal military events. Her combat uniforms reminded her of missions she couldn't discuss with anyone. And her SEAL equipment represented the hardest thing she had ever accomplished. She decided to take several of her older service uniforms to a military surplus store for donation. These were uniforms from her early Navy days that no longer fit properly. She kept her SEAL combat gear and her dress uniforms, storing them carefully in a cedar chest in her bedroom closet. That afternoon, Sarah loaded 2 large bags of uniforms into her car and drove to the donation center. She spent the rest of the day running errands and having dinner with friends. When she returned home around 9 o'clock, she was tired but happy. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus had been watching her house all day. He had seen her load the bags into her car and followed her to the donation center. When he realized she was donating military uniforms, his anger reached a boiling point. In Marcus's twisted mind, Sarah giving away her uniforms was disrespectful to all the men who had earned the right to wear them. He saw it as further evidence that she didn't deserve the honors she had received. He decided that she needed to be taught a lesson about respect. That night, Marcus waited until the neighborhood was quiet. He had brought a container of gasoline and a lighter, planning to destroy something that belonged to Sarah. Originally, he thought about vandalizing her car, but when he saw the bags of uniforms still sitting in her garage, he had a different idea. Marcus broke into Sarah's garage through a side window that she had left unlocked. The bags of uniforms were sitting exactly where he had seen her place them earlier. Without thinking about the consequences, he doused the bags with gasoline and set them on fire. The flames spread faster than Marcus had expected. Within minutes, the entire garage was engulfed in fire. Marcus panicked and ran back to his car, speeding away from the scene as neighbors began to notice the orange glow coming from Sarah's property. Sarah woke up to the sound of sirens and the smell of smoke. She looked out her bedroom window and saw flames shooting from her garage. In a state of panic, she grabbed her phone and ran outside in her pajamas, calling 911 even though the fire department was already arriving. The firefighters worked quickly to contain the blaze, but the garage and everything in it was completely destroyed. Sarah stood on her lawn in shock, watching years of memories go up in smoke. The neighbors gathered around her, offering comfort and support, but she felt completely numb. As the fire chief approached her to ask questions about the cause of the fire, Sarah realized that this wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately set her garage on fire. The question was, who would want to hurt her and why? The police arrived shortly after the fire department had the blaze under control. Detective Linda Rodriguez took charge of the investigation, immediately treating the incident as arson. The strong smell of gasoline and the way the fire had started made it clear this was no accident. Sarah sat on her front steps, wrapped in a blanket provided by a neighbor, watching investigators comb through the charred remains of her garage. The reality of what had happened was slowly sinking in. Someone had deliberately targeted her home, destroying her property and putting her life at risk. Detective Rodriguez approached Sarah with a gentle but professional demeanor. She had dealt with many arson cases, but something about this one felt personal. The choice to burn uniforms in the garage of a female veteran suggested this wasn't a random act of vandalism. During the initial interview, Sarah tried to think of anyone who might want to hurt her. Her work as a security consultant sometimes involved making recommendations that people didn't like, but nothing that would warrant this kind of retaliation. Her personal relationships had ended amicably, with no bitter breakups or ongoing conflicts. The detective asked about Sarah's military service, wondering if her groundbreaking role as one of the first female SEALs had created any enemies. Sarah admitted that not everyone had supported women in combat roles, but she couldn't think of anyone specific who would go this far. Over the next few days, Sarah stayed with her friend Maria while the police investigation continued. She felt violated and vulnerable, constantly looking over her shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. The sense of security she had worked so hard to build in her civilian life was completely shattered. The insurance adjuster confirmed that the garage was a total loss. All of Sarah's stored belongings had been destroyed, including tools, sporting equipment, and holiday decorations that held sentimental value. But what hurt most was the loss of those military uniforms, even though they were items she had planned to donate. Detective Rodriguez worked methodically through the case. She reviewed Sarah's social media accounts, looking for any threatening messages or suspicious activity. She interviewed Sarah's coworkers, neighbors, and former military contacts. The investigation was thorough but yielded few leads. Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling with guilt and fear about what he had done. The fire had spread much faster than he had expected, and he realized he could have killed Sarah or her neighbors. What had started as a plan to destroy some uniforms had turned into a serious felony that could send him to prison. Marcus tried to act normal at work, but his coworkers noticed he seemed nervous and distracted. He kept checking news reports about the fire, terrified that someone had seen him at Sarah's house. He considered leaving town, but knew that would make him look even more suspicious if he was eventually identified as a suspect. A week after the fire, Detective Rodriguez caught a break in the case. A neighbor's security camera had captured footage of a man walking through the area around the time of the fire. The image was grainy and taken from a distance, but it showed someone who clearly didn't belong in the neighborhood. The detective also discovered that Sarah had been receiving some negative comments on her professional social media profiles. Most were anonymous accounts posting generic complaints about women in the military, but Rodriguez noticed that several comments seemed to come from someone with detailed knowledge of SEAL training. Sarah tried to return to her normal routine, but everything felt different. She had always been confident and self-assured, but now she found herself constantly checking locks and looking over her shoulder. The violation of having her home targeted made her feel powerless in a way she hadn't experienced since her early days in military training. Her work performance began to suffer as she struggled to concentrate on projects. Clients noticed that she seemed distracted during meetings, and she started declining speaking engagements that would require travel. The strong, confident woman who had broken barriers in the military was now afraid to sleep in her own home. Sarah's friends and family rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Her parents wanted her to move back to her hometown where they could keep an eye on her. But Sarah refused to let whoever did this drive her away from the life she had built. During one of their regular check-ins, Detective Rodriguez shared her theory that the arsonist was likely someone with a military background who knew about Sarah's service record. The choice to burn uniforms suggested symbolic significance rather than random destruction. This information both relieved and worried Sarah. It was good to know that she probably wasn't being targeted by a random criminal, but the idea that someone from her military past harbored enough resentment to commit arson was deeply unsettling. Sarah began going through her memories of military service, trying to identify anyone who had shown particular hostility toward her presence in male-dominated units. There had been plenty of skeptics and critics, but most had eventually come to respect her abilities and dedication. One name kept coming back to her thoughts: Marcus Thompson. She remembered him as one of her fellow SEAL trainees who had dropped out early in the program. He had been openly resentful of her presence and had made several comments about women not belonging in special forces, but Sarah had lost track of Marcus years ago and had no idea where he was living or what he was doing. She mentioned his name to Detective Rodriguez, who added it to her list of people to investigate. Finding him would be challenging, but it was the best lead they had so far. As the investigation continued, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be crucial. She refused to be intimidated by whoever had attacked her home. Instead of hiding away and hoping the police would solve the case, she decided to take a more active role in finding her attacker. Sarah began reaching out to her old military contacts, trying to track down information about Marcus Thompson and anyone else who might harbor resentment about her career. She was careful not to interfere with the police investigation, but she used her own network of veterans to gather intelligence. What Sarah discovered would soon lead to a confrontation that would test everything she had learned during her years as a Navy SEAL. Sarah's networking efforts paid off faster than she expected. A former Navy colleague named Jake Williams called her 3 days after she started making inquiries. Jake worked in private security and had access to databases that could track down former military personnel. Jake had found Marcus Thompson living just 20 miles away, working as a security guard for a downtown office building. More importantly, Jake had discovered that Marcus had been posting angry messages on veteran forums, specifically complaining about women in combat roles and mentioning Sarah by name. Detective Rodriguez was pleased with this information, but warned Sarah to stay away from Marcus while the police built their case. They needed solid evidence linking him to the arson, and a premature confrontation could destroy their chances of getting a conviction. But Sarah had other plans. Her military training had taught her the value of reconnaissance and gathering intelligence before taking action. She decided to observe Marcus discreetly, hoping to learn more about his current state of mind and whether he might strike again. Sarah borrowed a friend's car and spent several days watching Marcus at his workplace. She positioned herself across the street from his office building, using binoculars to observe his behavior and routine. What she saw concerned her greatly. Marcus appeared agitated and unstable. He was frequently argumentative with his supervisor and seemed to be drinking heavily during his lunch breaks. Several times Sarah saw him staring at photos on his phone with intense anger, though she couldn't see what the images showed. On the 4th day of surveillance, Sarah followed Marcus after his shift ended. He drove to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Confirming the address that Jake had provided, Sarah parked at a safe distance and watched as Marcus stumbled up the stairs to his second-floor apartment. That evening, Sarah made a decision that Detective Rodriguez would later call both brilliant and reckless. She decided to get closer to Marcus's apartment to see if she could gather more evidence of his involvement in the arson. Her SEAL training had included advanced surveillance techniques that civilian police didn't typically use. Sarah waited until after midnight, then approached Marcus's apartment complex on foot. She wore dark clothing and moved silently through the shadows, using skills she had perfected during night operations overseas. The complex was poorly maintained with minimal lighting, making it easy for her to move undetected. Marcus lived on the 2nd floor, and his apartment had a small balcony that faced the parking lot. Sarah could see light coming from his windows and heard the sound of a television. She positioned herself behind a dumpster where she could observe his apartment without being seen. Through the partially open blinds, Sarah could see Marcus sitting at a small table with his laptop open. She couldn't make out details from her distance, but his body language suggested he was engaged in heated online conversations. Occasionally, he would stand up and pace around the room, gesturing angrily at the computer screen. Sarah spent 2 hours watching Marcus before deciding to get closer. She found an unlocked maintenance ladder that led to the roof of the adjacent building. From this elevated position, she had a better view into Marcus's apartment. What she saw made her blood run cold. Marcus had created a shrine of sorts on his wall, with printed photos and newspaper clippings about Sarah's military career. Some of the photos had been defaced with red marker, and there were angry handwritten notes covering much of the display. More disturbing was what appeared to be a planning board with photos of Sarah's neighborhood and her daily routine. Marcus had been stalking her for weeks, learning her schedule and identifying vulnerabilities in her security. The arson attack had clearly been just the beginning of a larger plan. Sarah photographed everything she could see using her phone's camera with a telephoto lens. The evidence was compelling, but she knew it wouldn't be admissible in court since she had obtained it through illegal surveillance. Still, it confirmed her suspicions and gave the police direction for their official investigation. As Sarah prepared to leave, Marcus suddenly stood up and walked toward his window. She ducked down on the roof, hoping he hadn't spotted her. Through a crack in the roof access door, she watched as Marcus opened his window and looked out into the night, as if he sensed someone was watching him. After several tense minutes, Marcus returned to his computer. Sarah waited another hour before carefully making her way back down the ladder and returning to her car. The entire reconnaissance mission had taken nearly 4 hours, but she had gathered crucial intelligence about the threat she was facing. The next morning, Sarah called Detective Rodriguez and shared her findings. Though she was vague about how she had obtained the information, Rodriguez was frustrated that Sarah had taken such risks but admitted the intelligence was valuable for building their case. Rodriguez obtained a warrant to search Marcus's apartment, but when officers arrived, they found it empty. Marcus had apparently fled during the night, taking his computer and most of his personal belongings. The stalking display had been hastily torn down, leaving only tape residue and pushpin holes on the wall. Sarah felt responsible for Marcus's escape. If she had contacted police immediately after her surveillance, they might have arrested him before he could run. Now he was somewhere out there, still angry and potentially more dangerous than before. The police issued a bulletin for Marcus's arrest, but finding him would be challenging. He had military training that would help him evade capture, and his unstable mental state made him unpredictable. Sarah knew that he would likely try to contact her again, but she had no idea when or how. Detective Rodriguez assigned extra patrols to Sarah's neighborhood and advised her to vary her daily routine. But Sarah had already decided on a different approach. Instead of hiding and waiting for Marcus to make his next move, she was going to draw him out on her terms. Sarah began making public appearances again, speaking at veterans events and posting on social media about her schedule. To outside observers, it looked like she was refusing to be intimidated by the arson attack. In reality, she was setting a trap for Marcus, using herself as bait. But Sarah wasn't planning to face Marcus defenseless. In her bedroom closet, carefully stored in a cedar chest, was her complete SEAL combat outfit. The gear that had seen action in some of the world's most dangerous places was about to be put to use on American soil. Sarah knew that when Marcus finally came for her, she would be ready. The question was whether her years of elite military training would be enough to stop a man who had nothing left to lose. Sarah spent the next week carefully preparing for what she knew would be an inevitable confrontation with Marcus. She studied the layout of her neighborhood, identifying strategic positions and potential escape routes. Her military training had taught her to always have multiple plans for any situation. She also reached out to 3 of her former SEAL teammates who lived within driving distance. Without revealing the full details of her situation, she asked them to be on standby in case she needed backup. They agreed without question, understanding that their bond as teammates transcended their military service. Meanwhile, Marcus was spiraling deeper into paranoia and rage. He had been living in his car for the past week, moving from parking lot to avoid detection. He blamed Sarah for ruining his life, and believed that destroying her reputation would somehow restore his own sense of worth. Marcus had been monitoring Sarah's social media accounts obsessively, noting every public appearance she made. He was planning something bigger than the garage fire, something that would humiliate her in front of the veteran community and prove that she didn't deserve the respect she had earned. Sarah's opportunity came when she announced on social media that she would be speaking at a weekend veterans retreat at a remote conference center outside the city. The location was perfect for her purposes, isolated enough that civilians wouldn't be endangered, but public enough that Marcus would see it as an irresistible target. Detective Rodriguez strongly objected to Sarah's plan when she learned about it. She wanted Sarah to cancel the appearance and let the police handle Marcus when he was eventually found. But Sarah convinced her that this might be their only chance to catch Marcus before he hurt someone else. On Friday evening, Sarah drove to the conference center and checked into her room. She had arrived a day early to scout the location and set up her defenses. The center was surrounded by woods with only one main access road. It was exactly the kind of terrain where her SEAL training would give her a significant advantage. That night, Sarah opened the cedar chest in her temporary accommodations and carefully laid out her SEAL combat gear. The black tactical uniform still fit perfectly, and each piece of equipment brought back memories of missions in hostile territory. She methodically checked every item: night vision goggles, tactical vest, communication devices, and non-lethal weapons. Sarah had decided early on that she would not carry lethal weapons. Despite everything Marcus had done, she didn't want to kill him. Her goal was to capture him alive so he could face justice through the legal system, but she was prepared to defend herself with whatever force was necessary. Saturday morning brought the first day of the veterans' retreat. About 50 former service members had gathered for workshops and group discussions about transitioning to civilian life. Sarah noticed several attendees who seemed nervous about her presence, still uncomfortable with the idea of women in combat roles. Sarah gave her scheduled presentation about leadership and teamwork, but her mind was focused on watching for any sign of Marcus. She had positioned herself near windows and exits, maintaining situational awareness throughout her talk. Several participants commented on how alert and professional she seemed. As evening approached, Sarah made her final preparations. She changed into her SEAL combat gear and took position in a wooded area overlooking the conference center's main entrance. Her teammates were stationed at different points around the perimeter, maintaining radio contact and ready to respond if needed. Marcus arrived just after midnight, parking his car about half a mile away and approaching the conference center on foot. He was carrying a backpack filled with spray paint, smoke grenades, and other items he planned to use to disrupt the retreat and humiliate Sarah in front of her fellow veterans. Sarah spotted Marcus's heat signature through her night vision goggles when he was still 200 yards away. She tracked his movement as he circled the building, looking for the best way to break in. His approach was clumsy and obvious to someone with her training, but he clearly believed he was being stealthy. Marcus chose to enter through a rear service door that he had forced open with a crowbar. Sarah allowed him to get inside the building before making her move. She wanted to catch him in the act of vandalism, providing clear evidence of his criminal intent. Inside the conference center, Marcus made his way toward the main auditorium, where Sarah's presentation materials were still set up. He began spray painting obscene messages about women in the military on the walls and stage. His hatred and resentment poured out in every angry stroke of the paint can. Sarah entered the building silently through a window she had prepared earlier. She moved through the darkened hallways like a ghost, using skills perfected during dozens of night operations. Marcus had no idea she was there until she spoke from the shadows behind him. "Hello, Marcus," Sarah said calmly, her voice echoing through the auditorium. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus spun around, dropping the spray paint can and fumbling for a flashlight. When the beam found Sarah, he gasped in shock and fear. She stood in full SEAL combat gear, looking every inch the elite warrior she had trained to become. Her night vision goggles reflected the flashlight beam, giving her an intimidating appearance. "You destroyed my uniforms," Sarah continued, stepping into the light. "But you couldn't destroy what those uniforms represented. You couldn't destroy what I earned through blood, sweat, and tears." Marcus backed away, his courage evaporating in the face of Sarah's calm professionalism. He had expected to confront a frightened civilian, not a combat-ready Special Forces operator. His hand shook as he tried to think of an escape route. "You were never good enough to be a SEAL, Marcus," Sarah said, advancing slowly, "and you can't accept that I was." So you decided to become something else instead, a criminal who attacks women in the dark. The confrontation that followed would test everything both of them had learned during their military training, but only one of them had actually earned the right to wear the uniform of America's most elite fighting force. Marcus panicked when he realized he was trapped in the auditorium with Sarah. He pulled a knife from his backpack, waving it wildly while backing toward the stage. His military training had been incomplete, but desperation made him dangerous in unpredictable ways. "Stay back," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "You ruined everything. You took something that was supposed to be mine." Sarah remained calm, using her tactical training to assess the situation. Marcus was holding the knife incorrectly, and his stance showed he had no real experience with close combat. She could disarm him easily, but she wanted to end this confrontation without anyone getting seriously hurt. "Nothing was ever yours, Marcus," Sarah replied steadily. "You quit because you couldn't handle the pressure. I stayed because I belonged there." Marcus lunged forward with the knife, but his attack was clumsy and telegraphed. Sarah stepped aside effortlessly, grabbing his wrist and using his own momentum to send him sprawling across the floor. The knife skittered away into the darkness. Before Marcus could recover, Sarah had him pinned face down with his arms secured behind his back. Years of hand-to-hand combat training made the takedown look almost effortless. Marcus struggled briefly before realizing that escape was impossible. "It's over, Marcus," Sarah said, applying just enough pressure to keep him subdued. "The police are already on their way." Detective Rodriguez and her team arrived within minutes, having been stationed nearby as part of Sarah's plan. They found Marcus in custody, with Sarah maintaining professional restraint despite everything he had put her through. The spray paint on the walls and Marcus's backpack full of vandalism supplies provided clear evidence of his criminal intent. As the police took Marcus into custody, he continued ranting about women destroying the military and claiming that Sarah had received special treatment. His words revealed the depth of his mental instability and the dangerous obsession that had driven him to commit arson and stalking. Sarah watched from the shadows as Marcus was loaded into the police car. She felt no satisfaction in his arrest, only relief that the threat was finally over. She had proven to herself and others that she could handle any challenge, whether it came from enemy combatants overseas or troubled veterans at home. Detective Rodriguez approached Sarah as she was removing her tactical gear. The detective had mixed feelings about Sarah's unconventional methods, but she couldn't argue with the results. Marcus was in custody. There was overwhelming evidence of his crimes, and no one had been seriously injured. "That was extremely dangerous," Rodriguez said, "but also extremely effective. I'm not sure whether to arrest you or recommend you for a civilian medal." Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. "I spent years training for situations like this. I wasn't about to let someone like Marcus make me feel helpless in my own country." The veterans' retreat continued the next day, with most participants unaware of the dramatic events that had unfolded in the night. Sarah gave an additional presentation about personal security and threat assessment, sharing lessons learned from her recent experience without revealing all the details. Marcus was charged with arson, stalking, breaking and entering, and vandalism. During his court proceedings, military psychologists testified about his mental state and the factors that had led to his obsession with Sarah. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to undergo extensive psychological treatment. The case attracted national attention. When details were revealed about Sarah's background and the confrontation at the conference center, media coverage focused on her remarkable career as one of the first female Navy SEALs and her decisive action in capturing her stalker. Some critics questioned whether Sarah had used excessive force or taken unnecessary risks by confronting Marcus herself. But most veterans and law enforcement professionals praised her tactical skills and restraint in handling a dangerous situation. Sarah returned to her consulting work with renewed confidence and purpose. The experience had reminded her that the skills and mindset she had developed as a SEAL remained valuable assets in civilian life. She began offering specialized training programs for women facing security threats. 6 months later, Sarah received an unexpected letter from Marcus in prison. He had undergone therapy and wanted to apologize for his actions. The letter was rambling and somewhat incoherent, but it expressed genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. Sarah chose not to respond to the letter, but she kept it as a reminder of how military training could be misused when combined with mental instability and resentment. She became an advocate for better mental health resources for veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. The cedar chest containing Sarah's SEAL gear was moved to a place of honor in her new home's master bedroom. She never had to use the equipment again, but knowing it was there gave her a sense of security and pride in everything she had accomplished. Years later, when Sarah spoke to groups of young women considering military careers, she would tell them about the night she wore her SEAL combat outfit to face down a man who had tried to destroy her life. It wasn't the mission she had trained for, but it was the one that proved she truly deserved every honor she had earned. Sarah's story became a powerful example of how strength, training, and determination could overcome hatred and fear. She had faced down enemies in foreign countries and troubled veterans at home, proving that true warriors never stop fighting for what is right. The uniforms that had been destroyed in the garage fire were eventually replaced through donations from fellow veterans who respected Sarah's service and sacrifice. But the most important uniform, her SEAL combat gear, remained safely stored and ready for whatever challenges life might bring.